Hello, just a quick note from me at the top. There were some weird issues with Garth's audio. It kind of goes in and out. It didn't happen at the time of recording, so I didn't know that it was happening, and I've put every filter on this audio that I can, but I apologize for the weirdness of the audio. I hope it's still listenable and you still enjoy it, because this was one of the most thrilling conversations for me. Garth is one of my favorites, so please do listen, and I'm sorry for the strange noises, but yeah, hope you enjoy it. Hello and welcome to Books Up Close. I'm Chris Lloyd. This is the close reading show for readers, writers, and anyone interested in how texts get made. In today's episode, I talk to Garth Greenwell about his novel Small Rain. We talk about a passage from partway through chapter 4. I should say, when I started this podcast, like Garth, you were on my list of people I needed to talk to, so I am so happy you are here. You don't know how happy I am.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me.
Of course, Garth Greenwell is the author of 3 books, most recently Small Rain, which won the 2025 PEN Faulkner Award for Fiction and the PEN Oakland Josephine Miles Literary Award. A Guggenheim Fellow, his writing on culture appears widely, including in The New Yorker, The Guardian, Harper's, and elsewhere. He also writes the Substack newsletter To a Green Thought, which is very good. You must subscribe. He is a distinguished writer in residence at New York University. I'm so happy you're here. I want to talk to you. I love your brain. I love your books. So yeah, this is a joy for me.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, I've been screaming about your books for so long. If anyone is like, what do I read? I'm like, go read any of these 3.
Well, bless you. Thank you so much.
And I think we've got a lot to say about close reading as well, because you do a lot of this on your Substack too, of like other people's work. I'm thinking especially of the Raven Leilani essay you wrote. I can't remember what magazine that was in, where you read a passage of Luster, and you do proper close reading of that passage. It's very exciting. So when I ask you how you feel about close reading, I feel like you're going to have thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny when you ask me about it. I mean, obviously, it's sort of a one of the principal activities of my life. I mean, I feel like my whole life is based on a kind of gamble about, a central belief I have that art is a source of value, or that art allows us to line up our lives with a source of value. And with the idea that that value is, so far as we're concerned, infinite, in the sense that it's on such a scale that if it's not infinite, if infinitude doesn't exist, it might as well be infinite. So far as we're concerned, like no amount of looking is going to exhaust a Cézanne painting. No amount of reading is going to exhaust a great poem. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that the act of close reading, of sort of tuning yourself to a work of art, whether that's a painting or a poem or a piece of music, that is a way of accessing that value. I mean, it does feel to me like one of the sort of higher uses to which we can put our existence, because I think art is something without which it would be impossible for us to know ourselves, that art is central to humanness. And therefore that in both making art and also trying to access this value in art, trying to train our attention on art, we are engaged in one of the activities that allows us the fullest access to and also use of our humanness.
And Small Rain is really a book about our humanness, right? In so many ways. The body at its limits, time at its strangest. I mean, I like doing these close readings and not necessarily telling listeners everything about the passage, the stuff around it in case they haven't read it. But do we want to gloss Small Rain briefly so they have context for this passage, or do we just jump straight in? How do you feel?
I mean, I think it's worth saying, this is a book about someone in a profound health crisis, someone who in his early 40s is facing a real possibility that he might not get to leave the hospital. He suffered a tear in his aorta, and the book chronicles kind of 10 or 12 days that he spends in the cardiovascular ICU. And it's probably worth saying about this chapter that, the strangest thing in the novel is the opening of this fourth chapter section of the novel, in which the narrator just at great length sort of reads and meditates on a poem. So this is a passage about reading.
Yeah. And I thought, this is a close reading show where we talk about close reading. So why not do a close reading of a passage about reading? I thought, let's just go meta, or, go big or go home. So yeah, I'd love if you could read it for us. This passage would be great.
Sure. And maybe also to know that the narrator in his past taught high school. And so he's thinking here about teaching poems to his high school students. Read it again, I would tell my students. Read it more slowly. When they looked up baffled by a poem by Elizabeth Bishop, maybe, whom I loved, baffled not because anything was difficult or unclear, but because nothing seemed to happen. Because they almost always thought and sometimes said, what was the point? Read it again. Read it more slowly. That was the whole of my pedagogy when I taught my students, who were pressured everywhere else to be more efficient, to take in information more quickly, to make each moment count, to instrumentalize time, which is a terrible way to live, dehumanizing. It disfigures existence. But it was difficult to defend the alternative, to justify it in terms of outcomes and deliverables, costs and benefits. It was indefensible by that logic. Its value lay in demonstrating the possibility of other logics, other relationships to value, other ways to live. The point was to perceive reality, I wanted to tell them, to see things that are only visible at a different speed, a different pitch of attention. The value of poems is tuning us to a different frequency of existence. But that knowledge is experiential. You can't explain it or demonstrate it or guarantee it. You can only try to tempt students toward it, entice them. And that had become harder and harder over the years when I taught high school, which were the years when everyone got smartphones. When I started, they were novelties, prestige items, and when I finished, they were ubiquitous. It had become more difficult for me, too, to find my way back to poems, to the mind space of poems. I'm on my phone as much as anybody else, scrolling and liking, atomizing my attention.
Thank you so much. I recognize this, teaching people about reading. There's so much I want to say about this, and a few friends who I told I was doing this today, they were like, we want to ask about sentences. I feel like more than anyone, more than any writer I know at the moment, like you care about the sentence as a unit, right? In the way that poets talk about the line, I feel like Garth Greenwell cares about the sentence. And this book, probably more than the other two, although, I don't know, maybe we could debate that, like the length of the sentences in this book are really kind of unfolding. And part of that is mirroring thought, right, for much of this book, because he's so in his head, right, this guy in the bed. But it's also mirroring other kinds of, I don't know, a kind of like ongoingness, right? He's thinking and he's rethinking and he's questioning. And I just want to ask you, about how you approach the long sentence, like as a writer, like how you are holding that in your brain and on the page. We'll talk more about how you write later, but like how you're thinking about the length of sentence.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm writing, when I'm drafting, there's really not a lot of thinking happening, or not a lot of propositional thinking happening. I mean, one of the crucial things for me about close reading is that I think close reading is an artist's education, like close engagement with works of art that seem to us great. Like that is where we get our education. And in some way, when I'm, reading somebody else's work or writing about someone else's work, I'm hyper analytical in a way that is the opposite of how I am when I write. When I write, there's something that feels much more corporeal. It feels much more as though I am trying to find a way to like move through a space with a certain kind of balance. And it really does feel to me like a collaboration. I mean, it's not that I have this sort of sovereign will and intelligence that is going to say what it intends to say in a certain sort of formal scheme. It's instead that I'm trying very hard to feel the energy of a sentence, and to in some way take my marks from the sentence itself. So there, and that sounds very maybe mystical, but in fact, I think it's very concrete. Like, I mean, one, the energy of the syntax, just because of how English works, like with each word you put down, the field of choice radically narrows. And it comes to like, just in terms of like what part of speech could follow.
Right.
And so there comes a point in a sentence where, the decision becomes, and again, decision feels too heady. It's like a bodily movement. Do you want the pleasure of sort of going where the sentence wants to go? Or do you want the pleasure of somehow escaping that desire of the sentence, like on a purely syntactical level? But then there's also the fact that because of all the close reading I've done, because of, an aesthetic formation, which has meant spending hundreds or thousands of hours with Baldwin and James and memorizing Shakespeare sonnets and reading Wallace Stevens and studying with poets like Carl Phillips and Frank Bedard and Jory Graham, certain movements in language, certain patterns of language are magnetized. And there's a way that tradition, or the multiple traditions in which my aesthetic formation has occurred, that those traditions exert a pressure on the sentence. There are certain patterns of language that I'm drawn to because of the formation that I've had. And those are things that I really welcome, that the sentence then becomes a collaboration. Because I do believe this cliche about art making, that sort of the work of art, if art making is going well, the work of art is smarter than the individual intelligence of the artist. And it's because of these, this pressure of language, this pressure of tradition, that can happen. So I feel very much that a sentence, I mean, obviously I am writing it, my will is engaged, but also it is something that is sort of leading me forward. And also for me, it is not just the unit of composition, but also like the equipment of navigation. So sometimes I think of sentences as like heat-seeking devices that are sort of turning towards the place of greatest intensity. And I often don't know very much, if anything, about what I'm going to be writing after this sentence. The act of discovery of fiction making happens at the level of the sentence and within the sentence for me.
Wow. And that's interesting because in this passage, which the first time I read it, I marked it because I was just like, it was in my brain. And I was like, I wonder which bits I marked. And I went back to it. I was like, this sentence is almost teaching is maybe a strong word, but how to even read this book, right? Like read it again. I would tell my students, read it more slowly. So we've got already a repetition, and there's another read it again, read it more slowly in the next sentence. So repetition is like a real key. Again, I don't want to say device because that sounds too strategic, but a key feature of this narrator's thinking and speech. But even read it again, I would tell my students, read it more slowly. When they looked up Baffled by a poem by Elizabeth Bishop, maybe, whom I loved, baffled, like the turns of thought are, as you say, like this heat-seeking, which I really like as an image, moving through, we're kind of with his thought. It's like sometimes he's thinking aloud, sometimes he's telling us. I imagine it in different ways sometimes, that it's like he's making sense of it to himself as well as to us. But I love that those early turns, like read it more slowly, a poem by Bishop, maybe, whom I loved, baffled. Like there is rhythm here too, and the turn. And it feels like you as author, whether, you Garth or like author Big A is saying, could you slow down?
Yeah,
this is not something you can rush through.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, and that was something that was brought home to me very early, kind of in my literary education, that relationship between, I guess, attempting to get beyond a kind of instrumental approach to a literary text, or a kind of extractive approach, like, oh, there is some meaning here I need to get out, which then I can sort of carry with me, and instead understanding that the meaning of a poem is the experience of the poem, and that it can't be extracted, and that it can't be instrumentalized, that instead the value of poems comes in their allowing us access to a different mode of being, as opposed to some paraphrasable little nugget of wisdom we could carry with us. And I guess, very early on, I wasn't thinking about this, but like, one of my earliest beliefs about poems comes from Elizabeth Bishop, who, in an early essay, like, quoted or found, or maybe it wasn't an essay, but she found this quote somewhere. I feel like it was in a review. Gosh, when I was in graduate school, I could have given you the citation, but I feel like she found this idea in like a review of an anthology of metaphysical poets. And it's the idea that a poem doesn't present a thought, but instead a mind thinking. And that, that idea, that sort of the ideal is to present not thought as something fixed and portable, but instead thought as an activity, as a movement, is something that's very appealing to me. And I think those repetitions, the way that a sentence can fall back on itself and then move forward and you can feel that it's exploring and trying different possibilities. I think sometimes to some readers that can feel like messiness, and I understand that. And it's something that, when I go back and read my first novel, to me, like, the sentences I'm writing now are clearly related to those. It's not like it's a different writer.
Right.
But those sentences are much more poised and formal. And there was a way that I did feel, again, I would never have put this in propositions, but that I was looking for in Small Rain, like a different kind of movement.
Yes.
Something that was looser and more capacious and maybe capable of more surprise. I wanted like more apertures in the sentences, more places where something foreign to the sentence or to what the sentence thought it was could kind of break into the sentence.
And that like kind of mirrors the narrator's experience, right? Like, he is lying in bed, unable to move, do anything, really see people. Like, it's set during COVID as well, right? So like his aperture is also like this, like contracting
Totally
all the time, in that he's thinking about his partner, then he's thinking about poetry, then he's thinking about music, or like the state of, social relations in some parts. And so to have that kind of mirrored at the sentence level, that, this sentence could go another way. Even the way he, in that line, baffled not because anything was difficult or unclear, but because nothing seemed to happen, because they almost thought and sometimes said, I like that little balancing, always thought, sometimes said, what was the point? And I went, like, to me, there's also like a little wink there about like this book, right? Like, sure. This is not a book of action, shall we say, how much readers have taken. This book is such like an immersive experience. If you read it, you're kind of in it. I don't think I came up for air when I was reading. I read like each section at a time and kind of stopped, because I was like, I think I need to put my head out of a window. I feel so immersed in this man's body. So I think there's a kind of funniness of being there, being like, nothing seems to be happening. And then the very next line is, read it again, read it more slowly. And you're like, I feel like I'm being taught here to read. I think, most texts do that, right? They teach you how to read them in a way, or kind of give you at least a map of how you could read it.
Sure.
And that's when he said, that was the whole of my pedagogy when I taught my students, who were pressured everywhere else to be more efficient, to take in information more quickly, to make each moment count, to instrumentalize time. That two, right? He's getting it. It almost sounds like an argument he's had to make before.
Yeah.
Right. Like, this is his, like, let me tell you about.
Yeah. Well, this is his. I mean, it's his sort of vindication of the humanities. I mean, it is where this becomes a little polemical, and you sense that he is speaking into a kind of argument.
Yeah.
It was important to me in this long, because this is nestled in this long reading of a very short poem by the American poet George Oppen. it was important to me somehow, even though this guy is alone in his hospital bed. And like, this isn't one of those poems that he's taught a lot. Like, this is a poem that he has kept very close to him, in part because it's so mysterious. He knows his students would just be baffled by it. He doesn't know how to teach it. And yet, I wanted somehow to give the sense that, like, even when we're alone in bed, engage. I mean, there's a way in which the reading of a poem sort of at this pitch is an act of such intimacy. And yet it's also relational. So, I mean, as he's reading a poem, like his students and these conversations that he's had over years with his students, that has become part of his reading. So, in some sense, there is a social aspect.
Yeah.
Even though there's nobody there for him to talk to, he's talking with all of these people that he sort of carries within himself and brings, therefore, to his reading of any poem.
Yeah, and I think, the idea of teaching as well, right? Like that this isn't just I'm a writer and I'm sharing my work in different spaces, but like he's always sharing work, right? He's trying to bring other people in, right? That's what we do as teachers, right? It's like, hey, there's this text, I need you to understand it in some way or take something from it, right? And pedagogy runs through all of your 3 novels, right? Like, if it's the same narrator, if it's not, whatever, we can have that discussion or not. But the idea of teaching, of kind of reaching out to the other in a relationship of, I have something I know or think about and want you to also think about it, runs through these 3 books in such like an interesting way. Like, this is the one where I guess the narrator is most explicit about, like, this is what I want to do in teaching.
Yeah.
And the thing he wants to do more than anything else is like, I can't actually tell you.
Right.
You can't explain it, demonstrate it, or guarantee it. You can only try to tempt students towards it, entice them. And like those 2 words, tempt and entice. Like, this is about desire, right? Like, this is about, and desire and teaching also runs through cleanness. That's
Very
a story.
much.
That's a thing for another day. Yeah, I'm interested in those kind of words, right? Like, in this early part, he's really talking about information, instrumentalization, dehumanization, these really like heavy words. But the shift is towards, actually, to pull someone in, you can only just like draw them. Like, there is desire here. There's a subtlety that I'm really interested in.
Yeah, and I mean, this is something about teaching the humanities, and it's why it's so hard to defend the humanities in these conversations that take as normative the kinds of sort of skills and measurable abilities that pertain in STEM classes, say. Whereas in the and like, I think, one of the tragic things that has happened, at least in the United States, is that humanities departments have tried to make arguments justifying themselves in those terms. And I feel like once you start trying to use those terms, you've given up the game, because the humanities are about something else. I mean, the humanities are about trying to understand, like, what is the point of being a human being? Like, what is, the end in the sense of the goal, the telos of our existence, and how can we achieve that? It's about a way of being. And so, as opposed to a kind of instrumental knowledge that allows us to manipulate the world in a certain way, that's not what the humanities are about. And so I do think the most powerful thing, when I think of the teachers who have been most powerful for me, I mean, they taught me lots, they taught me lots of information, but much more than that, they modeled for me a way of being. They modeled for me, they revealed to me some potential for meaning in human life that I was not aware was there. And that's what the humanities are about. They're about, equipping students to live lives that feel meaningful to them. And when I look around at the chaos and disorder of the world, I mean, it seems to me that what we are suffering from is a crisis of meaning, of that sense of meaning, and the kind of, very often, a kind of ambition for measurable, wealth, measurable prestige, measurable power that is actually expressive of just an absolute despair about real meaning,
right,
and about the possibility of it.
But even in this moment, right? Like, there's some real alliteration of that D sound that I didn't see on the page until you read it aloud. But like dehumanizing, difficult, defend, deliverables, right? It was indefensible, demonstrating. Like, it really gets quite heavy with those D's, right? Like this, as his force kind of like ups, it was indefensible by that logic. Its value lay in demonstrating the possibility of other logics, and then it almost like the air comes out of that anger. Other relationships to value, I mean other ways to live. Like, that I mean is like a really, like, that's so the narrator of this book, right? They're like, I'm telling you this really strong argument, but actually what I mean is actually this other thing, this other way more profound thing. I just love that I mean that you allow the sentence to kind of change and unfold as the narrator would think it.
I like that reading a lot. I mean, I do think one of the dramas in the book is sort of the narrator, who has been schooled in this kind of instrumental reasoning, this debate. There's stuff in the book about his father having been an attorney, and he's been schooled in these ways of relation that he thinks are super problematic and doesn't want. And I do think there's a way that he repeatedly in the book finds himself arguing and then reminding himself that actually he wants a kind of thinking that escapes argument. Like he wants a different, that actually the kind of fixity and calcification that happens the moment you step into a debate, that's what he wants to get past, So yeah, I like the way you put that. There is this kind of, I think repeatedly in the book, this sort of rhetorical inflation of a kind of argumentative style, and then sort of that inflation is popped or pricked and it deflates back into this truer space of exploration or bewilderment.
Yeah. It's those little human moments where you'd see the narrator not as someone who's kind of railing against something or kind of lecturing us, but rather it's like, no, I'm just trying to get at the best way of saying this.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure every novel allows prose to do that, right? I'm not sure. I had this conversation with Sasha Debevec McKenney about her poems, and she writes very long lines. And I was asking her about like the long line versus the short line and what a long line can hold. And she said like, oh, I feel much safer with the long line, right? Because she's like, there's just so much you can like put in there. Whereas if you've got 3 words on a line, like you're really exposed. And so we were kind of talking back and forth about that. But for me, there's always something like riskier about like letting something spread out and trusting that the reader can sit with it and let it flow, right? I always think about the, not to get too theory, but the kind of like Derrida idea that meaning only comes like retrospectively at the end of the sentence, right? You have to keep reading to the very end, and only then can you make sense of the whole thing you've just done. So you're always in suspense as you read.
Yeah.
Right? His point is that language is always in suspense until the end, and then it's the end, right?
Yeah.
That's a dumbed down version of Derrida, listeners. But you know what I mean. And I think there's an interesting way that some of these sentences, they go one way and then you turn it another way and you're like, oh, I needed that ending actually. I needed it to string out for so long in order to get that payoff, if you like, quote unquote.
Yeah, I mean, and I do think, it's funny because for so long, certainly North American prose has been governed by, sort of the shrunken white strictures of economy, or like, Hemingway, those stupid ideas that people take from Hemingway that he obviously didn't follow himself about, like cutting adverbs, active verb, etc., which I mean, that can be productive of really extraordinary writing. Like, I think Hemingway is one of the great stylists in English. But there's also, there is, I think, that alternative value of a kind of copiousness and a kind of thinking that comes, as you say, sort of in this movement. But there is also irony. Like, I mean, I'm quite drawn or compelled by sort of both extremes. And there is a kind of irony that, there's all of this language flowing out about this poem by George Oppen, who is very much someone who, the poems are concentrated. They're sort of etched out of silence. Every word counts. There's not a spare word. So I hope that the book, as in sort of all of the thinking I do about art, I'm always trying to find ways to remind myself that art is always bigger than anything we can say about it. And that, like, any idea I have about art, actually, I love art that embodies, the opposite value, and that is the world we want to live in, which is also something, like, when I was in graduate school, I felt so surrounded by polemics about what poetry should be or shouldn't be, etc. And all of that is so stupid, I mean, of course, like, we want to live in a world where poetry is always escaping our ideas about it,
Yeah, and that the point was to perceive reality. I wanted to tell them to see things that are only visible at a different speed, a different pitch of attention, a different frequency of existence. And that, that kind of links to what you're saying there. This is about like another mode altogether. Like, the question you're asking is wrong. Like, we're talking about different things in different ways.
Yeah, that's right.
As one of my colleagues says, you got the wrong end of the wrong stick, right? Like, it's just a whole other thing. And obviously this section is all about poetry, right? And the narrator really cares about poetry, but as you just kind of hinted at, like, your prose is very much different from that. And much of what he's saying here is that poetry takes us elsewhere. But you must imagine prose does that too? Or do you think prose and poetry are operating in...
No, I mean, I think this is true of any work of art.
Yeah.
So, poetry, the narrator is a poet. He thinks a lot about poetry. And he teaches poetry. So, but he also does think about visual art, and then especially he thinks about music.
Yeah.
And so, no, I mean, I think he would make that claim. I would certainly make that claim about art in general.
And I just think it's like the small poem is this, like, just like this little case study, if you like, of like the way that this one thing can open a whole other world, right, to the people reading. But by the end of the passage, he talks about the students and their phones. It had become more difficult for me too to find my way back to poems, to the mind space of poems. And I mentioned that idea that, this isn't like an age thing, right? This isn't like, oh, the kids these days and their phones, but it's like we've all been hijacked or rewired to this different kind of interaction, scrolling, liking, attention, atomization. But how does one find one's way back to a poem? Right? Is the question. Is it just reading slowly? Is it close reading? Is it... Do you know what I mean? Like, what does the narrator think about the mind space of poems? How does one get there for him?
I do think mainly it is like putting your phone in a different room and sitting with a poem, and and being patient with yourself as your mind sort of scuttles around looking for whatever dopamine triggers it can find, and then slowly settles into a poem. I do think that's it. Or going to a museum without your phone and sitting for an hour in front of a painting, or going to, I'm in Iowa City now, but I spent the last semester in New York. And when I'm in New York, I go to the opera as often as I can. And I always sit in the balcony, in the first row of the balcony, so I can see down into the orchestra. And it is just amazing to me. And it makes me sad and angry, and I want to be that old guy sort of shouting. Although actually it's old people who are the worst about this, at least at the opera. People who are on their phones, like, during the opera, like, put your phone away during the opera. And, and of course the screen, you see it just lights up. And so you see these lit screens down there. And those aren't kids. Like, those are people who are older than I am for the most part. And I do think, just like, put away your phone and just sit and, experience something that is not controlled by your scrolling or your swiping, and give yourself up to it. Like, that experience, I think it's so crucial. Like, if we really lose that and lose our capacity for that, I mean, I think we will be something we won't recognize. And I find that, well, I mean, for lots of people, that's the goal, I mean, to sort of be transhuman, to sort of escape the human. That's not my goal. It fills me with terror and dread, I guess. or
Yeah.
just not, maybe even not terror, but like just like deep, deep sadness.
Yeah, deep sadness. I do enough ranting about generative AI, but the humanness is the thing that the narrator is telling us to focus on, right? Like humanness is both the cause of this piece of art, right? Like it's where the art came from, but it's also the thing that the art takes us towards, right?
Yeah.
Like if you can sit with it, you might find other ways to live. There may be
Yeah.
other ways of seeing, thinking, doing, being, living, and that is like this fundamental transformation, right? It's a thing, and I guess that's what you're saying, like about, like give yourself over to a work of art. That's about like giving up something, right? Giving up
Absolutely.
some agency, giving up control or comfort or whatever. And I think that's scary for some people.
Sure, of course it is. I mean, and in the opera, in any sort of experience in the theater, I mean, you might have a bad experience. Like that happens all the time. And then you're just stuck,
Yeah.
and if you're having a bad experience of Tristan and Isolde, you're stuck for a really long time. But that's also part of humanness. I mean, another thing that I think, and I feel this especially in the United States, I remember, I mean, quite literally, my father who grew up dirt poor on a tobacco farm and then became an attorney. He used to just, one of the earliest things I can remember him saying to me is like, there's no point to doing something if you're not going to be the best at it. And like, that's such a horrifying way to live, because actually someone was saying something about this to me the other day, like trying to say, oh, but I was saying something about art, and he said, oh, but if you believe that about art, then there's no difference between a kid playing with crayons and Cezanne. And I was like, well, look, like obviously there's a difference, and it's important to hold on to the difference in certain kinds of thinking. But in another way, no. I mean, art making is art making, and it doesn't matter if you're bad at it. Like it is better for you 100% to, make a bad drawing or write a bad poem than to spend an hour scrolling on your phone. Like one of those is an expression of humanness, and the other one is a kind of relinquishing of humanness. And it's the way, another sort of interesting argument I got in a friend, there's a lot of people sort of arguing like, oh, AI art actually isn't better. It's that when we think something is AI made by AI, we degrade it, we judge it more harshly. And I was like, well, that just seems obviously false to me. But it's the wrong question. Like, is it better or worse? Like, of course, there's lots of human-made art that's atrocious,
Yeah.
but it's atrocious in such interesting ways, and AI art is all bad in the same way. And there's something in that too. Like, I would so much rather live in a world of atrocious art that is expressive of humanness than in a world of, AI slick competence.
Yeah.
Like, so I feel like, again, that's another kind of debate that we fall into. And it's like the minute you fall into the debate of like, is a art worse or better than human made art? Like that question actually is giving up the game. Like you can't allow yourself to engage with that question, because the real point is lost in that question.
Yeah. Okay, everyone, we need to refuse the questions. But this is like, yeah, you cannot let that question set the terms of the dialogue.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, you're right. I get that. This is helpful. This is helpful for my brain, Garth. Thank you. Because I feel like I spend all of my days fighting people about this. So
Absolutely.
this is useful to me. I want to use this as a segue, an awkward segue into your writing practice. I want to know, yeah, do you always write in the same way? Do you write by hand? Are you in the same spot in your house, the same time of day? Like, do you have any of that kind of structure, or are you writing differently depending?
So I do have that structure when I'm working on a novel. When I'm working on a novel, so I only write fiction by hand.
Okay.
And that's really crucial, to sort of write by hand. No screens anywhere. Where I am right now, which is in my studio in my house in Iowa City, is where I usually do work, but sometimes I'll go to a cafe or something. And it also, like, when I'm working on a novel, it's the first thing I do. So I don't have any rules for myself about how much I have to write, because I feel like that's really not in my control. I do have rules about how much time I spend. So like basically the rule is like my ass has to be in the chair for a certain amount of time. And if that happens, it doesn't matter if I've written a word or not.
Right.
But so long as I've been in my chair with my notebook open and I haven't been doing anything else, like I've done my job, like I've done my work for the day. So that's all, yeah, that's all part of a writing routine. I like writing at home where I have this big L-shaped desk, and on either end there is a bed for my cats. And most mornings, actually not just mornings, like pretty much the whole day, like I'm working at my desk and my two cats are sleeping in their beds next to me. And that for me, and my partner, who's in Spain right now, but my partner is upstairs in his studio working. And like that for me is happiness, to be in that situation.
It sounds ideal. And like the light is coming through those windows. I can see you've got beautiful trees outside. It looks pretty idyllic.
It's pretty nice.
Whereas my cat just won't sleep. He'll just like sit on me or like stand on the keyboard, or he wants to be involved in everything.
That's also fine. I was just looking at a photo because this semester when I was in New York, it was the longest I've ever been separated from my cats. And so I would just look on my phone at photos of them. And one of the first photos of them, we adopted them during the pandemic and they were babies when we adopted them. And they're both on my lap and I have my notebook. I'm writing like the very first pages of Small Rain. And they're, trying to grab my pen and playing with each other. And that also is happiness.
I love this.
Yeah.
Do you care about the notebook? Do you care about the pen?
I used to very much. So I started writing prose when I was in Bulgaria, where I taught for 4 years. And I was very addicted. I walked to work every morning, which was like a mile, mostly along this main sort of boulevard. And there were these little shops, these sort of shacks along the way. And there was a stationery place, which was where kids would buy school supplies. And I got like the cheapest possible little ring bound notebook that had like these pictures of like kitsch cliche Bulgaria scenes, and it said Nasha Bulgaria on it, our Bulgaria. And so I had to write in that notebook. And then there was a pen that you cannot get in the United States that I loved. I mean, it was so cheap, it was like both of those things were very cheap, but that was crucial. I still write with cheap materials. It's important to me to write with cheap materials, and in like spiral bound notebooks. Sometimes people will give me gifts and they'll give me some like fancy, beautiful notebook, and I always say, "Oh, thank you so much. It's so beautiful." And I know I will never write in it. Like I can't imagine using something like that.
That's so funny. I had this same conversation with Fatima Bhutto, but not because she has a very different taste in books, but she likes the notebook she likes. And people will always give a notebook. She's like, I don't know what to tell you, but I'm never using this. Like, it's just going to go on the pile with the other notebook.
My partner is also addicted to notebooks, but he has drawerfuls of notebooks of all different types. Anywhere he goes, he wants to buy a notebook. And he's always using them. Like I can't do that though.
I wanted to ask, obviously you teach literature and writing. Do you have any prompts or exercises that you do with students that you think listeners might benefit from?
Well, I don't do many exercises. It's funny. I feel like I did more when I was teaching poetry than when I'm teaching prose. I've always been jealous of visual artists who have, they're able to sketch. That's something that I've always just been hugely jealous of, that they can open up a notebook and sketch. And so I do tell my students a kind of sketching exercise, which is, it's just you sit down with your notebook or a sheet of paper, you make 5 columns, one for each of the senses, and you just record sensory details. And it is a way of sort of making a snapshot. And it was very helpful to me when I was working on Cleanness, because my first novel I wrote and finished while I was in Bulgaria. But Cleanness, I wrote about half of that in the United States. And I found I would get blocked because I couldn't, for whatever reason, so much of that book is invented, but I could not invent anything about place. Like, it felt like a violation, but in such a stupid way. Like, I would think, oh, I don't remember what this particular street corner smelled like at 2 a.m. And I'd be like, just like, whatever, somebody's smoking a cigarette, or somebody's, or there's like somebody selling roasted nuts or whatever, but I just couldn't do it. And so when I would go to Bulgaria every year and spend a month or two, and I would just go to places that I knew I was going to write about, and I would just like fill pages of sensory detail. And that then I was able to draw on when I was writing those stories.
That's amazing. I will be trying that. Okay, one question. Do you have any good books or essays on writing practice that you go to or recommend? Are there ones that you think about?
The best book about kind of creative engagement that I know is actually not about writing. It's not even about art making. It's by an art historian and critic, T.J. Clark. And the book is called The Sight of Death. And that's maybe the most inspiring book I know. It's a book of close reading. It's a book of, he's just looking for a very long time at these Poussin paintings. But that is a book I turn to when I want to feel inspired about the possibilities of art and of making art.
Amazing. The question to end that I ask everyone is, what other books do you want to recommend? They can be old things, new things, stuff not yet out. What are the books that you want to thrust into listeners' hands?
With my Substack, I have a book club. And every other month we meet and we talk about a new book, which sometimes is a book that I've read and am excited to share and think about with other people. And sometimes it's a book that's new to me, but that for whatever reason I want to read. And we are reading in June, next month, a book by a Croatian writer named Ivana Sajko that's called Every Time We Say Goodbye. And I've been hearing sort of murmurs about this writer from European friends. Like, she just won a big German prize. She lives in Berlin. And so I feel like people are talking about her in Europe, but like, as always in North America, we're being very slow about it. She has 2 books available in English, published in North America by the very small, wonderful, but very, very small press Biblioesis. And we're reading her most recent book to be published here, which is called Every Time We Say Goodbye in English. It's actually called Little Deaths in Croatian. This book, I think it is extraordinary. Every chapter is a single sentence, which I could imagine feeling hokey, but I find these sentences just electrifying. And really, like, it's been a long time since I have read a writer new to me and just sort of felt like the top of my head was coming off. Like, I was so excited. So Ivana Sajko, Every Time We Say Goodbye.
There's an amazing recommendation, and I'm already excited. Long sentences, single sentence. Yeah, I'm in. You sold me. Garth, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you like this one, maybe go back to episode 23 with Salim Haddad for some very different queer fiction, but also of a person making an argument out loud. Or go to episode 26 with Sasha Debevec McKenney, who I mentioned in the episode, for her poetry, where we talk about line length. Please subscribe to the show if you haven't already. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts or on YouTube. Share with people in all the places. Follow the show and me on Instagram. You can get show transcripts and more information on the Substack. The show is made possible by an Impact Accelerator Award from the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the University of Hertfordshire.